The colony of British Columbia was established after threats and encroachments from the United States. Its enlightened ideals were partly reversed by the democracy that followed and the racism of the U.S.-linked labor unions. Before 1858, there were no settlers, no military, and no religious missions on the entire British Columbia mainland. This is because the government was an unusual company state, which enforced a no-settlement policy. Wherever it governed, Aboriginal communities were stronger than any other part of North and South America. But in the 1840s, 3,000 settlers from the U.S. arrived, believing their destiny was to govern the whole continent. The slogan was 54-40 or fight. The president threatened war. Britain considered abandoning the coast, but withdrew to the 49th parallel. Governor James Douglas moved his administration from Old Vancouver to Victoria. The U.S. Army waged a dozen wars, removing native people from their lands onto remote reservations. Throughout the violence, native chiefs like Kamayakon, Joseph, and Sitting Bull fled to the 49th parallel, what they called the medicine line, that had the mysterious ability to stop the U.S. Army. U.S. tribes were forced to sign treaties forbidding contact with native people in British Columbia. But in 1858, 30,000 U.S. fortune seekers streamed over the border up the Fraser Canyon seeking gold. After meeting native resistance, they formed military units, burned villages, killed many, and forced their way into the country. This caused an uproar in Britain. The powerful Aborigines Protection Society urged Parliament to adopt measures to protect the Indians before the territory could be annexed by the United States. It opposed colonies except for South Africa and British Columbia, believing these would prevent a worse fate for native peoples. The Aborigines Protection Society defended native people in British territories. The Anti-Slavery Society defended them in other countries. Their memberships were almost identical, including members of Parliament, influential citizens, even a king. Its publications regularly documented atrocities in the U.S. They were the political force behind the blockade of Africa, in which the Royal Navy intercepted 1,600 ships and freed 150,000 African slaves being transported to the Americas. Oxford professor Herman Merivale had been a fierce critic of British colonies. He was recruited to head the colonies department and recommend a new model. He wrote, "The protection of natives should be withdrawn from the legislature and entrusted to the central executive. It should not just rely on a good systematic arrangement, but more importantly, a person of zeal, courage, and humanity." James Douglas was that person, chosen as the first governor, part black, married to an Aboriginal woman. He spoke the trade language Chinookwawah and had already opposed an elected assembly in defense of native people. Governor Douglas went around the province meeting 3 large First Nations gatherings to discuss the new colony of British Columbia. He wrote to London, "One subject preoccupied their minds, the abject condition of the native people by the American system of removing whole tribes from their homes into distant reservations where they are compelled to stay. They look forward with dread lest the same wretched fate await the native of British Columbia." He told them the government instructed that they should be treated as Her Majesty's other subjects, that the local magistrates would attend to their complaints and guard them from wrong, that they had instructions to stake out and reserve, for their benefit, all occupied village sites and cultivated fields and as much land as they could till or was required for their support. In a flurry of exchanges, Colonial Secretary Edward Linton defined the vision for the colony on 2 main principles. 1. First Nations communities would be reserved in place permanently. Linton wrote, The treatment of the native Indians demands your prompt consideration. Regarding the letter from the Aborigines Protection Society, invoking the protection of Her Majesty's government, I repeat my earnest injunctions to secure this object. He warned Douglas this country would be strongly opposed to arbitrary or oppressive measures. James Douglas sent surveyors throughout the province saying, "The extent of the Indian reserves be defined as they may be pointed out by the Indians themselves." 2. British Columbia would be multicultural. Outside the reserves, native individuals could own their own land privately, but this land would also be open to other settlers. Linton wrote, "There is a strong desire of Her Majesty's government to attract to this territory all peaceful settlers without regard to nation. Naturalization should therefore be granted to all who desire it." British Columbia was one of the first jurisdictions to be explicitly multicultural from its inception. But U.S. miners would have to swear allegiance to Queen Victoria. Many refused and left. Douglas acted on his instructions to attract immigrants without regard to nation. He invited 600 black people fleeing persecution from the U.S. and found a legal loophole so they could vote in their first election, not possible where they came from. Their votes elected the first Jewish legislator over a racist opponent. He welcomed Hawaiians forced from Oregon and Chinese gold miners. A London Times journalist noted, "There are no distinctions made against them in these colonies. They have the same protection as all other persons." Douglas reported that he hired and paid people equally, including Africans and Chinese. Douglas had confidence in the government. Prime Minister Stanley had decades earlier authored the bill to abolish slavery. Stanley Park is named after his son. Chancellor Disraeli would become the first Jewish Prime Minister. Linton himself was a respected author, who is still quoted, "The pen is mightier than the sword." James Douglas was unpopular with the first labor organization, the Working Men's Protective Association, which later changed its name to the Anti-Chinese Association. The U.S.-linked unions supported Amor de Cosmos' first political opposition and his Chinese head tax. The colony lasted only 12 years. Douglas's democratically elected opponents unraveled his policies as soon as he was gone. They sent surveyors back to reduce the reserves and remove the right of native people to own land off reserve. At the same time, the U.S. purchased Alaska and pressured Britain to give up British Columbia to resolve disputes. Some settlers petitioned the U.S. Congress to annex BC. Foreign Secretary Granville and Prime Minister Gladstone refused and paid $300 million to keep British Columbia out of the U.S. After the colony ended, the first fully democratic legislature removed the right of Chinese and Aboriginal people to vote. Democratically elected governments continued to undermine colonial principles with residential schools and a banning of the potlatch. It would be many decades before the province would return to the original ideals of Edward Linton and James Douglas in the colony of British Columbia.